I woke up to a sound I wasn't expecting. The deep, guttural growl of heavy machinery. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. Maybe it was a tractor from the neighboring farm. But when the noise didn't stop, I sat up in bed, rubbed my eyes, and grabbed my phone. It was barely 6 o'clock in the morning. No one should have been working this early, especially not on my land. Still half asleep, I shuffled to the window and pulled back the curtain. What I saw nearly made me drop my coffee cup. There, right in the middle of my property, was a massive hole in the ground. And not just any hole. This thing was wide, deep, and already filled with murky water. A bulldozer sat at the edge, its engine still running, and a group of people stood around admiring the destruction as if it was some great achievement. My stomach twisted as my gaze landed on the one person who had caused me nothing but trouble since the day I moved here. Margaret, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She stood proudly with her clipboard in one hand and a smug grin on her face. Her short, meticulously styled bob didn't move an inch, even in the early morning breeze. She was talking animatedly to a small crowd of HOA members, all of them nodding as if this was some grand community event. I stormed outside, not even bothering to put on shoes. The damp grass chilled my feet, but I didn't care. I was too focused on the fact that these people were on my land. What the hell is going on? I shouted, my voice slicing through the morning air like a whip. Margaret turned, her eyes lighting up with fake enthusiasm. Oh, good morning, Alex. You're just in time to see the final stages of our brand new community pond. Community pond? I stared at her, then at the gaping wound in my land, then back at her again. That's my land, I said slowly, trying to keep my temper in check. That's my damn land, and you dug a pond on it. Margaret let out a condescending chuckle and placed a hand on her hip. Alex, we had a vote at last night's HOA meeting. Everyone agreed that a pond would add value to the neighborhood. I blinked. I'm not part of the HOA. She waved her hand dismissively. Technicality. You live within the community, and honestly, Alex, you weren't using this land for anything productive. So, we thought we'd put it to better use. Imagine the kids fishing here, picnics by the water. It'll be wonderful for everyone. I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white. It's my land. Oh, don't be dramatic, she huffed. We already used HOA funds for this, and it's practically finished. It would be such a shame to waste it. I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and rage. This woman had the audacity to steal my land, dig a pond on it, and then act like she was doing me a favor. My blood boiled, but then something inside me clicked. I knew Margaret well enough by now. If I yelled, if I caused a scene, it would only fuel her ego. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I took a deep breath and forced a smile. All right, Margaret. You win. Enjoy your pond. Her eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something off. Wait, what? I turned on my heel and walked back toward my house, ignoring the murmurs of the HOA members behind me. Oh, she was going to regret this. By noon, the community pond was in full use. Margaret had called for a grand opening celebration, and the HOA members had gathered around, some of them dipping their feet into the water like it was some luxury resort. A few kids had shown up with their parents, tossing stones into the pond while Margaret prattled on about how she had personally overseen the project. I stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching as my property turned into a circus. I caught snippets of Margaret's speech, a place for peace and relaxation, a testament to community spirit. The way she spoke, you'd think she'd single-handedly built the Grand Canyon. I could already see the problems they hadn't considered. The water was already seeping into the lower parts of my land, turning the soil into an unworkable mess. The pond itself had no proper drainage. Within a few days, it would start to stink, and since it was built without any real planning, it wouldn't take long for mosquitoes to turn it into a breeding ground. But none of that mattered because this pond was about to have a very short life. That evening, I made some calls. First to a land surveyor, who confirmed what I already knew. This pond was illegally dug. Then to my lawyer, who assured me that I had every right to do whatever I wanted with my property. And finally, to a construction crew to make sure my next move would be spectacular. The next morning, I met Margaret at her favorite place, the HOA office, which was really just a converted garage with a fancy sign. She was busy typing away on her laptop, probably drafting the next ridiculous set of rules she wanted to impose. She barely looked up when I walked in. Alex, if this is about the pond again, I really don't have time. It's not about the pond, I said, leaning against the desk with a slow smile. It's about my new barn. That got her attention. She frowned, finally looking at me. Barn? Yep, I said cheerfully. I realized I actually do have plans for that land. So, I'm filling in the pond and building a brand new barn. Should be done within a month. Margaret's face went pale. You can't do that. Actually, I can. My land, my rules. But the pond was illegally constructed. You used HOA funds without permission. It won't hold up legally, and you know it. She stammered, her lips opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before, fear. And that was just the beginning. By the next day, the first trucks arrived. Bulldozers, dump trucks, construction crews. The HOA members stood in shock as the heavy machinery rolled onto my property, ready to erase every trace of Margaret's so-called masterpiece. Margaret ran up to me, wide-eyed. This is a disaster. You can't just destroy the pond. People love it. I grinned. Oh, I'm not destroying it, Margaret. I'm just improving my land. You thought this space was wasted before, right? Well, I'm making it useful again. The bulldozer roared to life, and the first scoop of dirt went into the pond. Margaret let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a scream and a gasp, but she could do nothing. The HOA members stood in stunned silence, watching their precious pond disappear before their eyes. And Margaret realized too late that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The pond was going down, and there was nothing Margaret could do about it. As the bulldozers roared, scooping up chunks of dirt and dumping them back into the water, the once proud community pond turned into a muddy disaster zone. The HOA members stood at the edges, their faces twisted in shock, while Margaret looked like she was about to faint. She kept sputtering, pointing, waving her clipboard as if it held some kind of magical authority, but no one was listening to her anymore. I leaned against my truck, watching the chaos unfold with a satisfied smile. The first layer of waterlogged soil turned to mush as the workers moved efficiently, following my exact instructions. Margaret's little masterpiece was disappearing fast. She kept pacing back and forth, muttering to herself, then suddenly snapped out of it and marched straight toward me. "You have to stop this right now," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "You're destroying a community resource." I raised an eyebrow. "A community resource, Margaret? This was my land. You never had the right to dig that pond in the first place." But, she stammered, looking around for support. Some of the HOA members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing they might have backed the wrong horse. A few of them muttered excuses and walked away, not wanting to get caught up in her mess. Others just stood there, helpless. Margaret took a deep breath, regaining some of her usual smugness. "Fine. If you're going to be unreasonable, then I'll have to take legal action. The HOA has rules, and you can't just destroy something the community voted for." I crossed my arms and smirked. "Margaret, you really don't get it, do you? There is no community decision when it comes to my land. I don't answer to the HOA. And if you want to take legal action, be my guest. Because I already spoke to my lawyer." Her face twitched. "You what?" I nodded, taking my time as I let the information sink in. "That's right. Not only do I have the legal right to do whatever I want on my property, but I also have documentation proving that your little pond was built without any permits, funding approval, or legal oversight. So, if we're talking about lawsuits, you might want to be more worried about what happens to you." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted toward the remaining HOA members, who were now looking at her like she had just led them into a burning building with no exit. The weight of reality was finally settling in. The bulldozers continued their work, and soon, the pond was just a muddy pit. I watched as the workers started laying the foundation for my next big move. Margaret was still standing there, frozen in place, when the first truckload of lumber arrived. The beeping sound of the reversing truck seemed to snap her back to life, and she practically lunged at me. "What are you doing?" she screeched. I grinned. "Oh, didn't I tell you? I'm building a barn. Since I suddenly have all this available land, I figured I might as well make use of it." Margaret's face turned a shade of red I didn't know was possible. "A barn? You can't just put a barn there." "I can," I said casually. "And I will. Her entire body stiffened, like she was about to explode. She turned to the remaining HOA members, waving her arms frantically. "Are you all just going to stand there? We have to do something. This is an outrage." Silence. No one wanted to get involved anymore. They had seen how badly Margaret had handled the situation, and they weren't about to go down with her. A few mumbled something about needing to be somewhere and quickly walked off. Even the most dedicated HOA busybodies were suddenly very uninterested in the conversation. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," she spat. I shrugged. "Whatever you say." By the next day, the barn framework was going up. The construction crew worked fast, and within hours, the shape of the building started to take form. The once peaceful neighborhood was now filled with the sounds of hammers, drills, and the occasional instructions being shouted across the site. Margaret, of course, was losing her mind. She spent the entire day pacing around the edge of my property, making calls, taking photos, and probably writing up the world's longest complaint letter. I could see her talking animatedly to someone on the phone, her arms waving wildly. It didn't take a genius to figure out she was calling the city, trying to find a way to shut me down. Too bad for her. I had already filed all the proper permits. Later that afternoon, I saw a city official pull up in a car, stepping out with a clipboard and a neutral expression. Margaret rushed to him like a starving wolf spotting its first meal in weeks. She jabbered away, pointing at the construction, waving her arms, clearly expecting him to put an end to it all. I stayed calm, letting her get it all out of her system. When she finally finished, I walked over and greeted the man with a friendly nod. "Hey there. I assume you're here about the construction." The official gave me a polite nod. "Yes, we received some complaints." "Of course," I said with a smirk. "Would you like to see the permits?" Margaret's expression twisted in horror as I casually handed over the neatly filed documents. The city official took his time, looking them over, flipping through the pages, nodding to himself. After a moment, he looked up at me. "Everything seems to be in order." Margaret nearly choked. "What?" He shrugged. "The land belongs to Mr. Alex. The permits are valid. There's nothing illegal about the construction." Margaret sputtered like an overheated engine, her hands shaking with frustration. But, this is ruining the neighborhood." "A barn here." The official remained unfazed. "Ma'am, there's no regulation against barns in this zoning area. As long as it meets safety requirements, it's perfectly legal." Margaret's face looked like it was going to melt right off. She turned to me, eyes blazing with fury. "You're doing this just to spite me." I shrugged. "You dug a hole in my land without permission. I'm just making use of it." She let out a strangled noise and stormed off, her heels stomping against the pavement so hard I thought they might crack the ground. With that little problem out of the way, I got back to overseeing the construction. Over the next few days, the barn continued to take shape. The walls went up, the roof was secured, and the finishing touches were starting to come together. Every time Margaret passed by, her expression darkened more and more. She had tried everything, calling the city again, gathering the HOA members for another protest, even attempting to start an online petition. Nothing worked. By the end of the week, the barn was fully standing, a sturdy, beautiful structure that stood as a monument to Margaret's failed power trip. And the best part? I wasn't even done yet. The barn was finally standing, a beautiful and sturdy structure that not only restored my land, but also sent a clear message to Margaret and the entire HOA. It was a testament to the fact that no one could just walk onto my property and claim it for themselves. The fresh scent of lumber filled the air, and the wide-open doors framed the perfect view of the land Margaret had tried to steal. Every time she passed by, her expression turned darker. But she hadn't given up yet. I had expected her to throw one last tantrum, but instead, she did something even worse. She went quiet. That was the most dangerous version of Margaret. When she wasn't yelling, she was scheming. I caught glimpses of her whispering with some of the remaining HOA members, her eyes darting toward my barn like it was a personal insult. I could only imagine the ridiculous ideas running through her head. The silence didn't last long. A few days after the barn was completed, I noticed something strange, papers stuffed into my mailbox. At first, I thought they were just the usual HOA notices I always ignored, but when I opened one, my blood boiled. It was a formal complaint. Margaret had gone through the effort of filing an official grievance with the HOA, demanding that my barn be torn down because it was a nuisance to the community. The audacity was almost impressive. I took the papers, marched straight to Margaret's house, and knocked. The door swung open, and there she was, standing there with a triumphant smirk. "I see you got my notice," she said sweetly, as if she hadn't just tried to erase months of my hard work. I held up the papers. "Let me get this straight. You dug a pond on my land without permission, and when I built something legally, you're calling it a nuisance." Margaret didn't even blink. "Yes, the barn is ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Several residents have complained." I raised an eyebrow. "Who exactly?" "Because everyone I've talked to actually likes it." She folded her arms, her expression tightening. "That's irrelevant. The HOA rules clearly state that any new structures must align with the community's visual standard. Your barn does not." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Margaret, you do realize I'm not part of the HOA, right?" Her eye twitched. "That may be, but your property still affects the community." I shook my head. "No, Margaret. What actually affects the community is you using HOA funds to dig a pond on land you didn't own. And I'm willing to bet the city will be very interested in hearing about that." For the first time, Margaret hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if she had finally realized the size of the hole she had dug for herself. But being Margaret, she wasn't about to admit defeat just yet. I have connections. I'll take this to court if I have to." I smirked. "You really want to go to court, Margaret? Because I guarantee the first thing they'll ask is where the HOA money for that pond went. And when they find out you authorized it without approval, well, let's just say I hope you've got a good lawyer." Her face went pale. She hadn't expected me to fight back with actual legal consequences. She had been so used to bullying people into submission that she never considered what would happen when someone pushed back harder. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "Oh, I absolutely would," I said. "And just for fun, I might even invite a few reporters to cover the story. HOA president steals land for unauthorized pond. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Margaret's mouth flapped open like a fish gasping for air. She looked around as if expecting someone to come to her rescue, but there was no one left. The HOA members who had once hung on her every word were nowhere to be found. She was on her own. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA. It was short and to the point. Margaret had resigned from her position, effective immediately. There was no dramatic announcement, no desperate attempt to cling to power. She was just gone. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Without Margaret micromanaging every little thing, people started relaxing. I saw more kids playing outside, more people actually enjoying their homes instead of living in fear of some petty rule change. It was like a dark cloud had finally lifted. And as for my barn, well, I had one last surprise in store. A few weeks later, I sent out invitations to the entire neighborhood, except for Margaret, of course. I was throwing a big barn warming party, complete with food, music, and even a few animals for the kids to pet. The turnout was better than I expected. People showed up with smiles, bringing homemade pies and drinks, eager to celebrate something good for once. As the party kicked off, I stood back, watching everything unfold. The barn, which Margaret had tried so hard to get rid of, had become a centerpiece for the community. People laughed, danced, and enjoyed themselves in the very place she had tried to destroy. And the best part? I had turned a portion of the barn into a community animal shelter. A small section housed rescued farm animals, giving them a safe place to live while also giving kids in the neighborhood a chance to learn about them. Word spread fast. Even people from outside the community started visiting, donating supplies, and volunteering to help. What had started as a simple act of revenge had turned into something much bigger. As the sun began to set, I leaned against a wooden post, sipping a cold drink, when I saw her. Margaret. She was standing at the edge of the road, watching the party from a distance. Her expression was unreadable, but I could tell she was seething. This wasn't just about the barn anymore. This was about the fact that she had lost, completely and utterly. For the first time since she had moved here, she had no power, no control, and no one to back her up. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening shadows. That was the last time I ever saw her. A few weeks later, a moving truck appeared in front of her house. She was gone by the end of the month. No one really talked about her after that. The HOA still existed, But with new leadership, they focused on things that actually mattered instead of policing mailbox colors and grass height. The community thrived. People were happier. And as for me, I finally got to enjoy my land in peace. Margaret had thought she could take my land and turn it into a pond without consequences. She had assumed she could push me around like she did everyone else. But in the end, all she did was dig her own downfall. And I made sure she never forgot. Epilogue, a new beginning. The barn became more than just a structure. It became a symbol of resilience and community. The animal shelter flourished, and the neighborhood kids loved visiting the rescued animals. The once contentious land was now a place of joy and learning. Margaret's departure marked the end of an era of control and the beginning of a new chapter for Willow Creek. The HOA, under new leadership, became more inclusive and focused on initiatives that truly benefited the community. As for me, I found a new sense of purpose. The barn wasn't just a victory over Margaret, it was a testament to standing up for what's right. And as I watched the kids play and the community come together, I knew that sometimes the best way to win a battle is to turn it into something beautiful. The Battle of Willow Creek was over, but the story of the barn and the community it brought together would be told for years to come. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.